South Africa's economy is bleeding billions of rand every year due to out-of-control illicit activities. Now, this is according to a report by the Transnational Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade titled Organised Crime, Corruption and Illicit Trade, Spotlight on South Africa. Illicit trade includes illicit alcohol, illicit tobacco, fishing, wildlife trafficking, illegal mining, counterfeit goods, substandard and falsified medicines, illicit trade in food, fuel and apparel. So the South African Revenue Service estimates that illicit trade costs the South African economy, wait for it, 100 billion rand a year. The World Economic Forum says illicit trade poses a top 5 risk to the South African economy. Now, SA was grey-listed by the Financial Action Task Force in February after a Paris-based body found that the country's systems to combat money laundering and terrorism financing were insufficient. To discuss this report further, we are joined from France by Dr. Esteban Giudici. He's a senior policy advisor for Tracit. Dr. Giudici, thank you for joining us. It's good to have you here on the program.
No, good morning to you and to your audience, and thank you. We're happy to be here because this is a problem that needs to be visualized.
It absolutely does. I mean, when you talk about the amount of money that we are losing annually, 100 billion rand due to this. I mean, South Africa's economy is bleeding already without this, and billions of rands every year due to these rampant activities. I mean, I've been through all of them and listed the ones that are taking place. I mean, how is a situation like this allowed to take place?
Well, let me say that the South African economy is bleeding in part because of this. It's not only that, also because of this. Because illicit trade creates a parallel market that has like enormous and really diverse implications, negative implications. This we have showcased in a study that we conducted where we show how illicit trade undermines all the sustainable development goals of the United Nations, and notably those ones that are related to justice, because it's a problem that it's not only about the financial loss, which is very important, but it's also about the undermining of the core institutions to have rule of law in a country. And here I'm talking about justice system. It brings corruption, it brings organized crime, it brings other egregious forms of criminality, as can be trafficking in human beings, corruption, money laundering, financing of terrorism. All these problems are intrinsically related to illicit trade and financial flows. We also have an impact on the environment, because when there is an illicit market, it's non-regulated, and we all know what happens with the environment when things are not done according to the standards. Then it's a problem that has very serious implications for consumers, consumer security. It's very simple, this. Would you like to consume some medicines that they were not preserved in a correct way, or that they have been tampered with? Likewise with alcohol, with tobacco, the same thing if we are talking about apparel or electronic equipment, or auto parts, lubricants. These things that I'm mentioning, they have been, I mean, it has been demonstrated that there is illicit trade. I mean, there are counterfeit parts even in planes. I mean, this is a problem of safety, of guarantee, and besides that, it also creates problems for the economy, mostly for 2 reasons. Not only because the government is losing big amounts in tax income, but because of all these insecurities. The body that you mentioned, the Financial Action Task Force, has grey-listed South Africa, in big part because there is no response to this type of criminality.
Yeah, and that is the great worry here, because I suppose the question that needs to be asked is South Africa lacking the expertise to implement the law to effectively fight this illicit trade in South Africa, or is there no political will?
No, it's mostly a political will, determination. And here, we don't want to heavily criticize the government or the society or whomever is responsible for this. It's something that the whole world is learning together. If you want the problem of illicit trade, treating it as holistic criminal phenomenon, it's something that hasn't happened for a very long time. Let's say over the 15 years in the past, since we created Tracit like 7 years ago, this problem has become more notorious and it has become more apparent, what it generates. And in South Africa, we have a good tradition of law enforcement. South African people, professionals, they are really well They have lots of capacity and knowledge. The problem, and this is matching with the recommendations of the FATF, I mean, what needs to be done in South Africa to get out of this situation is that we need to enhance the law enforcement and we need to enhance cooperation. This is one of the most important recommendations, that it is also in our report. We need to have cooperation between the Revenue Service, SARS in South Africa, and the police, SABC, the forces, and we need to be all together because illicit trade, it is not something that we can tackle only from one dimension. Criminals are very intelligent and they are driven by money. And if we only put a high price, let's say, for instance, let's focus on smuggling and let's focus on customs control. That's good. It's going to be a good measure, but it needs to come together with other measures. Yeah. Otherwise, the problem is going to be in another place. And that's something that we need to look at. Well, it's in our recommendations. It's a recommendation of the FATF. But let me tell you that we see light at the end of the tunnel. The day before yesterday, we were releasing this report with the business unit in South Africa, and we have attendance from the Hawks, the SABs, and also from the Treasury of South Africa. And we have really good feedback. We are ready to set an agenda and work together towards this end. Okay. So the awareness is being raised, and that's important.
That is very, very important. But let me ask you this. I mean, obviously during COVID, that was a very difficult time to get your hands on anything. And we all know what happened, especially here in South Africa. Cigarettes you couldn't find. So that just fueled the illicit market. Same as with alcohol. People were just desperate to get their hands on things that they weren't able to. So I can imagine there was a massive increase in illicit trade of all kinds of goods during that time. But as we see that rise, did they manage to curb it? Did it manage to stop? Or is it once it's in the market, and it's now that is something that we need to try and bring down or not? I mean, what have you noticed in the trends?
Yes, you are right. Well, of course, during the pandemic, now that we can take some time to really meditate on what happened, it was difficult to know what to do. And South Africa undertook a way of restricting products subject to excise, alcohol and tobacco. This same thing happened in other countries like in Panama, Colombia for some time, in Mexico in relation to alcohol. And what happened? That's that kind of restriction, taking out legitimate products from the supermarkets, from the outlets, from the retailers. The only thing that you do is driving, exacerbating illicit trade. You are creating an illegal market because the consumers, they want to consume those products. And if they are not going to be provided in the way that they need to be provided, they are going to find alternative solutions. And there are always illicit traders to provide to that market. And this is what happened. And there was a huge loss in tax income. And what happened is what you just mentioned, is that once this kind of criminality roots, it's very difficult, much more difficult to eradicate it, or at least to curb it. And to our knowledge, when we are talking specifically about alcohol and tobacco in South Africa, it hasn't been curbed. Opposite to that, it has risen. When we are talking about tobacco, we are talking about before the pandemic, the levels were around 20% of the volume. Now it's more than 30%, probably up to 70%. We cannot measure it accurately because it's a legal market, but we can see it in terms of tax laws. And this is something we need to look at.
Yeah, and that's, this is the big problem. It's here and it's entrenched itself into the market. Prices during times of unemployment, where people don't have jobs, where people, want to carry on with their activities, but they don't have the funds to pay the prices that are out there. But there are places, and we know where this corruption is taking place, within law enforcement and border control agencies. I mean, these have been, and even in this report, identified as a big problem. What do you make of the corruption in the country and the roles that these agencies are actually playing in facilitating this illicit trade?
Well, I wouldn't put it in the way that they are facilitating it. I would put it that there are other priorities, not other priorities, but other things that are being looked at, because to our understanding, illicit trade is a very big priority. Because now South Africa has an 8% of inflation, but this can get worse very easily. And yes, it's true, corruption is a facilitator for illicit trade, but every system has glitches. But as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there is light at the end of the tunnel. It's a matter of creating the political will And what we are trying to do with Trace it, we are the voice of the industry. We are an independent NGO, and what we are trying to do is to catalyze the public-private cooperation. I mean, I could be talking hours about this, but this is the real what's going on in the world today. It's not anymore just the public sector taking the decisions, calling the shots. The private sector is becoming more prominent. We could discuss this theoretically. It's a tendency that has happened for the last 100 years, from my understanding, particularly in the realm of international affairs and within countries as well. We need to take responsibility. Private sector also needs to take responsibility, and that's why we are here today. We are trying to convey this message. We are trying to transmit this awareness that it's not only for the general public. I'm talking awareness, targeted awareness for policymakers.
Yeah.
We are informing them and telling them what's going on and why we need to do this. Just to wrap up my answer to that, all countries in the world, because this is not only a problem in South Africa. Myself, I come from Argentina, and in Argentina we have a similar problem, but with much worse inflation. We have seen these kind of situations also in Lebanon. In Turkey, we have recently deployed also a report. And what we see is that government societies, they need to take a decision. Are we going to allow this parallel economy? Because it's getting worse and worse. And if we have parallel economy, we are going to have worse services. We are going to have worse education for our children. It's going to be more poverty, and everything is going to be more precarious.
Indeed.
And I'm sure that we don't want those kind of societies.
We certainly don't, and it's a great threat. I mean, if we're already talking about the amount of money that we are right now, one can only imagine if this is left, how much worse it's going to get. Just finally and very quickly as I let you go, I mean, you did speak about limited investigations into this and also minimal deterrence penalties that enable these criminal networks to continue operating with a low risk of discovery. I mean, if you don't hold people to account and actually make examples of this illicit trade and the people involved in it, they won't stop. It'll just carry on. They're making too much money to stop. So, you know, the advice in terms of law enforcement and all of those things to stop this.
Yes, it's a lot of hard work, but there are specific recommendations. We need to investigate and conduct in-depth investigations, not just investigating the retailer who is in the street. That's probably not needed even if we really want to tackle this problem. We need to go after the mastermind, the big fish, and it's work in the sense that we just need to follow the money. This can be assimilated to what happened with the Italian mafia in the 90s. And that was dismantled. You need to follow the money. You need to recover the proceeds that belong to the South African people, that belong to the public domain, to be redistributed and especially to give it to the people that need it the most. And for this, it's important to follow some of the recommendations of the action plan that the government has with the Financial Action Task Force to get out of the grey list. They are very similar to the recommendations that we post in our report. Interestingly, we were working on these recommendations before the 24th February. That is when South Africa was released, it was grey listed. But let me tell you that, yeah, if we take these serious investigations, which need to be implemented also with economic and financial measures that we should discuss, there is, like, at the end of the tunnel, the results can be seen very soon. Very soon and immediate. Thank you so much for talking to us. Dr. Esteban Giudici talking to us about the rampant illicit activities that are taking place in South Africa. He's a senior policy advisor for Tracit.